Hello, hello, woohoo! So I think today we're going to talk about free will. Is there free will? Or what is free will? Ramesh Balsekar, who I used to visit in Mumbai, was really into talking about there is no free will or no doership. Ramesh wasn't so much into talking about no I, or the illusion of the I. He would say, of course you have an ego. So he wasn't into that whole kind of there's no I teaching. But he would talk about free will and no free will. And that everything was an act of God. So every movement that you do, everything you say, everything you speak is God speaking through you. And that even the I, the ego I, is God's movement as well. And he said that the importance of seeing this means it's the end of blame, shame, pride, guilt, and expectation. And that realizing that there is no doer and there is no free will takes away these dynamics in the personality structure. And I always think that at the end of this subject you don't want to have an idea about anything. So there's nothing that's true. So even what Ramesh said isn't truth. But it's an interesting idea to look at and to explore and to see what your ideas are. So he would say that most suffering comes from blame and guilt. That you blame others for doing things wrong, and that you're guilty for things you've done wrong, and that this is most of mental suffering. If I went to the way that I like speaking, which is the no I, talking about there is no I inside the body, you can see that, of course, that's the way it is, that there's nobody that ever did an action. And that if you believe you are an I, if you believe that are somebody, then what forms out of that belief is blame and guilt. That somebody else is guilty, that somebody else has perpetrated against you, and that you've been hurt by something that's external and separate from you. So you can see that it leads to very complicated thinking. And Ramesh used to say that most mental suffering was around blame and guilt. I would say that it's very important to allocate responsibility and to be remorseful if you have done something wrong, but there has to be this deep seeing that's beyond the intellect, that it's actually not you or their fault. So in the act, in the flow of life, you have to say, okay, you ran over my cat, so you have to pay for the medical bills. But this deep knowing that nobody did that there isn't someone separate from you. If this is all one reality, so if this is a reality of non-duality, so not two, then of course there can't be anybody that's guilty, and there can't be anybody that's crossed you. That's quite a full-on teaching. That's really radical. Psychologically, if you have a victim perspective in life, you might take on that perspective easier because you're okay to blame yourself or to take responsibility. So seeing that there's no blame out there is easier for you to psychologically do. But then you might take too much blame on yourself. It's actually coming back to having no ideas, but by talking about no doership, we can question this idea of free will. Like, who has free will? It's so beautiful, this subject. So in this moment now, who speaks? So everybody looks and thinks Lisa's speaking, but how am I speaking? I don't know how I learnt language. I don't know how that happened. I can tell you the process of what happened, how my parents did it, or how the schooling system did it, but I don't actually know how it happened. I can tell you how the brain works, but I actually, in this moment, I don't know. This body learnt to speak. I also can't tell you how I'm speaking. I'm not thinking and then speaking. So I'm not sitting there thinking, okay, now you have to say this sentence, now you have to say that sentence. It's way too quick. I'm just speaking. It's just coming out in this moment, and I don't know how I'm doing it. I don't know how I'm squeezing my voice box together and making the sounds. I don't know how this happens. But yet, in our society, we're so easy to say, Lisa spoke, that Lisa's speaking. But how? How do I speak? And this is quite obvious when we think about it. And it's quite obvious that it's appropriate in society to say, you are guilty, this is your fault, or this is your responsibility, because that's how our society works. So if somebody's cow makes a turd in your front room, they can come and clean up the turd. Like, this is appropriate. But it's not actually true. But we're so convinced by what we think. We put what we think above everything, above logic, above sense, above magic, above freedom, above ease. We think that is true. It's somebody's fault. But how? How did somebody do something? How did you arrive here? Maybe you can give me a very wise answer of how you arrived here, like you walked here, or that you decided to come here. But how is that happening? How does that mean that you did it? So you could have the idea that you have free will to think all these things, but how are you thinking? If you had free will, you'd be able to program your thinking. But who would even do that? Like, how is it all happening? How did you wake up this morning and think, I have free will and I'm going to go to Lisa's talk? The stories that you tell yourself give the appearance of free will, but there's not actually free will. It's a happening. And it's mysterious and it's unknown and it's magical. And we lost that magic by believing that our thoughts are true. We lost the magic of living by living in a story of ourselves. And the story of ourselves, for most people, becomes more and more difficult over time. Because our thinking mind is about overcoming problems. So if you see yourself as a story, then you are going to be a problem that needs to be fixed. So you're going to be judging your life as a problem. Our thinking mind evolved in order to fix problems, to fix our environment, to help us survive. So therefore we can only think of ourselves in that paradigm. We can't think of ourselves outside this seeking to survive, seeking to make our environment better. So we think of ourselves like that. So for an example, in order to survive, we can compare things to make things better. So we can compare this speaking system to another speaking system, and then through comparison of what's worse and what's better, we can adjust to make it better. We have to compare in order to make something better. There has to be comparison. In order to make our food better, we have to be able to compare it to something else. Otherwise, how would we think about making it better? It's part of what we've evolved to do, is think about making, it's comparing our environment and making it better. Like we look at our house as opposed to someone else's, and we see that they sweep the floor in a certain way and it looks better. So we do this. It makes that competition and that ability to judge makes us better at surviving. So that's the fundamental of us improving our environment, is comparing it and analysing it and then looking to see what is better. And we work as a group. We're always giving these ideas. So if you're ever in a creative if you're ever in a creative job, you know that you come to a brainstorming and you compare what's happened, you analyse what's happened, and then you all give ideas to make it better. So this is a fundamental functioning of our brain. So if we believe we are thoughts, our thoughts are going to be prone to comparison. So if you believe you're a thought, that you're somebody that walked here, the way that you do that is through comparison. It's through comparing. So, for an example, this is really simplistic, but the reason that you knew that you walked here was because you compared it to standing still. And you could see, okay, so I arrived here by walking. I wasn't standing still, I wasn't running. And we have this middle word called walking. So we compare it and we find it. So say if you're sitting here and you believe you are fat. How do you know that you're fat? Khaleesi is a slim dog. This is my dog. But she doesn't know she's slim. And sometimes she puts on a couple of extra kilos and she doesn't know she's put on weight and become plumpy. She doesn't have the ability to compare to other dogs. So if you've got like a really fat cat that walks in, it doesn't know it's a fat cat. Even if it's panting, like, and it's like, it's really struggling, and it rolls over and it can't stand up or it can't get through its cat flap. It has no ability to judge that it's fat. It doesn't know it's fat. It just is. There's no issue with the way it is. It's just that it's a bit uncomfortable for the fat cat because it's hot and it can't do a lot of things, and it struggles to stand and it's a lot of work to walk, but it can't think, okay, I am fat, my life would be easier if I was slim. This is something we suffer around a lot, is our body image. So we have the ability to compare. So we can either be skinny or we can be incredibly fat. Dependent on who you compare, who you compare yourself to is, dependent on who you compare yourself to is dependent on what size you are. So if I compare myself to a model, I am curvy. If I compare myself to somebody obese, I am skinny. There isn't a fixed way of being. The same with wealth. So if I compare myself to somebody that is on the poverty line in India, so somebody that lives in a village, in a very poor state, I am incredibly rich. I'm incredibly rich. If I compare myself to Donald Trump, I'm poor. So there's no fixed stories of who we are. It's dependent on the way you want to tell it. The same with goodness. If you want to be a good person, go and stand next to a very bad person. Don't stand next to somebody that's a saint. Then you'll be bad. It's quite simple. So therefore we can see there is no fixed self, and the self that we create inside is something that's based on judging ourselves in comparison to our environment. Everything you think of about yourself is a comparison. You cannot think about yourself without comparing. So, am I fundamentally white? Am I white? In comparison to somebody from Norway, I am not white. In comparison to somebody from Africa, I am white. Maybe they call me pink. It's unknown. So I'm not fundamentally white or blue. Ba, 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 ba. Don't put it too close, so you guys can hear me. Okay. So
maybe it's disconnected.
Here. So I am.
Check.
So I'm not fundamentally a colour. Yeah? I'm not fundamentally a colour. I'm not anything.
Check.
So what about you? What story is it that you would tell people about yourself?
Check.
Would you tell people that you are...
Check.
Would you tell people that you are tall? Is that true? In comparison to a Japanese person? Maybe. In comparison to a Dutch person or Australian, maybe not. So it's all about comparison. So there is no fundamental fixed self. You can see our mind is about analysing our environment and then finding a position of who you are, and there is no fixed way of being. If you've been brought up by very negative parents, or parents that are from the UK